Welcome my beloved student, how you doing? Hope you all are doing great and lovely. In this video we are gonna see, what if Deku awoke a hidden dragon Quirk? This is part 2 and for more amazing content leave a like, share and subscribe. And I wanna thank the author of this story named Smothered Sparks by Sirteddison. So do check out and leave kudos. Let's get in the video. I hope you know that I'm going to need a better explanation than that, Kurai. Shouda wasn't just angry, no he was downright furious. The man's brief explanation made a terrifying amount of sense. This wasn't the first time one of his students had been pseudo-scouted via the sports festival, and he doubted it would be the last. With Bakugo, his temper had been broadcast to the entire world, heroes everywhere knew him as hot-headed and villains believed he was destined to be one of them. His kidnapping had been a direct result of the school event. Every day he regretted not pushing harder for its cancellation that year. But despite his protests, the festival went on and they were still facing the repercussions of it. Now, he was staring at the previously believed deadbeat father of one of his most troublesome, read as beloved, students, as the man tucked said student into a hospital bed. Fucking hell he needed a nap, a long one. I would expect nothing less. Kurai responded. The man stood up from where he was leaned over and stretched out his back with a groan. I do hope that my explanation can wait until morning at least. I want Izuku to hear it as well, but the kid needs rest. And Eraserhead. The hero hummed in response. In the meantime I'd like to find out why my son is in the hospital. And so, he told him. He left out some important details. One for All and the boy's subsequent connection to All Might were absolutely off the table, but other than those national secrets, he told the man everything that conspired within the last few hours. He knew he should have kept more to himself, but sue him, he was exhausted, and with the man being a pro, he was allowed certain leeway in what information he would be able to legally share. He had zero doubts about the man's identity by the end. Kurai was almost silent throughout the entire tale. Underground heroics forced you to take news like this with straight expressions, no bullshit, no emotion. And he had to hand it to the man, he hid them well. Flickers of his anger still slipped through, most in the form of literal flickers of flame and slight growly noises whenever the man breathed out. But they were slight enough that a less trained individual would have no hope of noticing them. After his explanation was finished, the man groaned a low sound. For the first time in his interactions with Kurai, Shouda felt his gut tighten. His mind was screaming danger. Something about his demeanor had changed. Where is she? He growled. Shouda allowed himself a slight intake of breath. Kurai was angry, that much was obvious, but his anger was directed at Izuku. He wasn't a danger to Shouda or his student. Now, he felt his own anger bubble up inside him. Inko is being held at the precinct, their best detective and a friend of mine is handling her interrogation. A manic grin stretched across the man's features. His eyes flashed red for a moment out of habit. Kurai looked enraged. I think I'll pay her a visit. Shouda couldn't help the matching grin that attacked his own features, stretching his lips around sharp teeth. The cruel, vindictive part of him couldn't help but enjoy the idea of Inko being forced to confront the father of her child. There was also the added bonus of Tsukauchi being there to validate Kurai's story. His vindictive side won out and he pulled out his phone. I'll tell the detective. It took less than 3 minutes for the interrogation to pick up speed. 2 minutes and 37 seconds precisely. At first glance, Inko was distraught. She sobbed and demanded to see her son, to make sure her little Izu was alright. She babbled about her worries, and she seemed completely clueless as to the fact that Izuku had been hurt due to her actions. She was brought into the interrogation room and left alone at the table. Then, she went quiet. A steady line of tears were still streaming down her face, but she waited in otherwise silence until someone else joined her in the room. The detective entered the room, trying to exude a nonchalant nature. He wanted Inko to feel comfortable for now, she didn't have to know that they were investigating her. Hello ma'am, I'm Detective Tsukauchi. Can you tell me what happened this evening? He took his time with his words, getting comfortable with a hot cup of coffee and a recording device before he had even opened his mouth. Ordinarily, he was required to inform all individuals he interrogated of his quirk, however there were specific situations where he was allowed to make an exception to that rule. One of those exceptions occurred when he was speaking with someone suspected of abuse. Keeping his quirk under wraps was an easy way to quicken the pace of these investigations and get the victim away from the abuse quickly, or in the case that no such abuse was happening, then both people could return to their ordinary lives. Either way, use of his quirk helped. It was an exception he made use of lots. Inko's story was overall normal. She spoke of her worries when she saw her son, saying he looked exhausted and anxious. She told him how she'd made him his favorite foods and drinks to take care of him, the way she said that rang warning bells in the detective's head, and when he became dizzy and drowsy, she thought he was just tired and led him to the couch for a nap. That hero school really isn't good for Aizu, she started. He shouldn't have even gone in the first place. I don't know how his quirk came in so late, but he was better off without it. My poor boy is always getting hurt now that he doesn't have me to take care of him. Her tears had faded by now. At this point, she looked more angry than anything, rolling her lower lip between her teeth in what Tsukauchi assumed was a nervous tic. All of her words rang true, but the detective didn't miss the left-out information or the little pauses as she spoke, as if she was dancing around something. The woman continued rambling. I hope that hero Eraserhead gets what's coming to him. I can't believe he hurt my poor boy like that while he was resting. At that, the detective blanched, his bored facade cracking. He had been mid-sip of his coffee and began to choke as what she had said rang as true. She truly believed that she hadn't done anything that had hurt her son. She genuinely believed that Izuku had been fine before Eraserhead had arrived on scene. The idea made him tremble with rage. If Eraserhead hadn't shown up when he did, if he'd given Izuku just a bit more leeway, then it was certain the teen would have been dead. All the while his mother would have been none the wiser. Tsukauchi hadn't seen Izuku much when he had first arrived, but he had seen the boy's pale face and purple tongue lolling out of his mouth. It had been unmistakable that the boy had been dead. Yet his mother hadn't even noticed. Hadn't noticed or hadn't cared. His mind supplied unhelpfully. Midoriya-san, he started calmly, Eraserhead did not hurt your son, in fact, he is the only reason Izuku is still alive right now. He made sure to triple-check that he was still recording as he spoke. Inko's face twisted into something terrible and she glared at Tsukauchi, standing up from the table suddenly. You're lying. Izuku was perfectly fine, I was taking care of him, I always do. It was that damned hero and that school that did this to him, corrupting my poor little Aizu, making him believe he could be a hero. My precious boy shouldn't have even had a quirk, I made sure of that, I protected him, she yelled, bits of spittle flying across the table. Or maybe she's delusional. Midoriya-san, I need you to sit down now or I will be forced to call security. He wiped the spit off of his face and kept his tone calm and collected even as he felt his heart spike at her last sentence. Shouldn't have even had a quirk, true, I made sure of that, true. She may not have realized yet, but she had admitted something that would be incriminating. Now, he needed to keep her talking. She took a few deep breaths, then her face flushed with heat and she sat back down, smoothing her skirt and bowing. She seemed to switch between each persona like someone was flicking on and off a light. Possible mental illness, flipping emotions, delusion-fueled ideas. I am very, very sorry, detective, I didn't mean to be so cruel, I was allowing my emotions to take hold of me. She apologized, the face of a concerned mother taking over her features once more. Her words again rang as true. He worried how skewed this woman's ideals had to be to justify how she drugged Izuku, yet not justify acting unkindly to a detective. It is quite understandable, ma'am. He reassured with false care. Truly he hoped she would react more, give him more dirt so they could stick their charges. I'm going to ask you some basic questions now, and I'd appreciate it if you answer them as honestly as possible. She nodded in response and gave the man a sweet smile that had his stomach rolling as it truly seemed genuine. Now, what is your name and relation to Midoriya Izuku? My name is Inko Midoriya, true, and Izuku is my son. True. Tsukauchi mentally crossed out several theories related to the possibility of her not being his biological mother and continued. Do you or Izuku have any other immediate family? She paused at that, biting her lip. Izuku's father is in America and my parents are dead. My brother visits sometimes, but it's been a while since I've seen him. True. Something was off about the way she mentioned the boy's father and something prickled in his mind, there was a half-truth somewhere in that sentence. Is Izuku's father present in either of your lives? No. He left, ran away when I got pregnant. Truth and two lies. Oh? He prompted, careful to keep his posture open. He's a no-good deadbeat, lie, didn't want kids, lie, so he left me to raise little Aizu all by myself. She pouted and he saw tears form at the corners of her eyes, a decent performance, and one he may have been inclined to believe if his quirk wasn't pinching at every other word. Inko was lying, telling a well-practiced tale that painted her in a sympathetic light. I'm sorry, he gritted out, that must have been hard. Just play along, earn her trust, get more info. It was. She nodded solemnly, her shoulders relaxing. Moving on, could you tell me the nature of yours and Izuku's father's quirks? Oh, her shoulders tightened again, well, mine is a simple telekinesis, I can attract small objects towards me. Hisashi had a for everything quirk. Truth and a half-truth. Again about Izuku's father. Is there anything more to his quirk? No. Just the fire, that's it. Lie. Her voice was frantic, almost panicked. He saw her hands clutching at the fabric of her skirt tightly. I don't see what this has to do with Izuku. Okay, stay calm, stick to the questions, keep your posture relaxed. It's just basic procedure, Midoriya-san. Could you tell me what Izuku ate and drank at your home tonight? She gave him a quick rundown of the food and its ingredients. Is that everything? He asked again, once she was done listing ingredients. She wrung her hands together under the table and readjusted her seat. Yes, there was nothing else in the food I made. She lied, her lips pinched together. When can I see Izuku? Her tone was urgent, almost pleading. Soon, I promise. He placated, only a few more questions, again just basic procedure. She let out a soft sigh, then sat straighter. At those words, the doors to the interrogation room opened wide and in came several officers. One held the box full of Quirk suppressant cuffs they'd found under Inko's bed. The other held a new box that was filled with the powders they had found in the woman's duffel. She gasped as they placed both the boxes on the table with a thud. Tsukauchi dutifully kept his face blank. Can you tell me what is in these boxes, Midoriya-san? He tried to keep the accusation out of his tone. They were found inside of your home. And no. She startled, jumping up from her seat. She looked around the room with begging eyes. I've never seen those suppressants in my life. Lie. A heavy pause came after, he felt his lips twitch up slightly. I never said they were suppressants. With that, the silence grew thicker. One moment, then another, then. Midoriya Inko snapped. I wanted to help him. These were helping him. Keeping him safe and normal and I can protect him. Please, this is good, he's supposed to be quirkless, he needed to be. He can't be a hero, no he can't. He can't get those gross scales and I needed to protect him, my little Izu, please, you don't understand. She alternated between yelling and threatening to pleading softly and begging, much of her words barely muttering as the officers approached her. She jumped away from the table and shoved the boxes off. The cuffs clattered across the floor. No. You don't get it. He couldn't have that Quirk. He couldn't have his father's. Midoriya Inko. You are under arrest for possession of an illegal drug, providing substances to a minor, drug abuse, Quirk growth negligence, Quirk neglect, third-degree attempted murder, falsifying Quirk and other government documents and illegal drug testing. Everything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, he continued on with the usual spiel as his officers placed the wailing woman in handcuffs. Please. Please, I just wanted to keep him safe, please. She continued begging. Tsukauchi felt his vindictive joy falter. As much as he hated what she had done, she was telling the truth. She believed that she was helping, that she was genuinely doing what was best for her son. Honestly, that made this so much worse. Midoriya-san, he prompted gently. The woman met his eyes with a sniffle. Izuku went into cardiac arrest tonight due to a drug overdose, an overdose on the Quirk suppressants that you gave him. Her resolve faltered. He could see something crumble in her mind as for a moment she stopped spluttering. I did that? She asked, and her voice sounded so young, so innocent in that moment. Tsukauchi had long since stopped smiling. Yes, ma'am. You did that. She paused and opened her mouth to say something, then closed it. Something seemed to shut off inside her. She stared ahead blankly as the officers walked her out of the room, no one saying a word. The moment the door had closed behind his officers, Tsukauchi felt his eyes fill with tears. He slumped into the chair and curled himself over the table. No matter how long he'd done this job, no matter how many cases he dealt with, some still hit him harder than others. He was a sensitive man, and cases like these drained him. Inko had done cruel things, the charges pressed against her were serious and didn't paint a pretty picture, but she truly loved her son. She truly believed that everything she had done had been what was best for him. Despite her skewed perspective, she loved Izuku. Yet she warped that love to justify horrible things. It hurt more than if she were just some cruel manipulative abuser, then at least he could comfortably hate her without an ounce of sympathy. But hearing her words, seeing her distress and panic was something he hadn't expected. She was so human, so lost, and so twisted. Prison time was unavoidable and well-deserved, yet she needed help as well. He took a shaky breath, the image of Izuku puking and sobbing, while attached to life support devices in the ambulance came to mind. He had to stay focused, he had to remember what the consequences of Inko's actions had been, he had to remember that they didn't even know the full consequences yet. He couldn't afford to feel sympathy for the woman, no matter how twisted her psyche may be. He exhaled slowly, forcing the tears away from his eyes before sitting up. He dragged a trembling hand over his face, easing some of the tension between his brows, before taking a long sip of his coffee. He heard the clicking of the lock and twisting of the metal door as it dragged open along the linoleum floor. Sir, Eraserhead is on the line, says he needs to talk to you, that it's urgent. He let out a low, grumbly sigh, squeezing his eyes together for a moment before standing and making his way to the door. The officer in the doorway paused, giving him a curious glance. Are you alright, sir? She asked. He looked the woman up and down, stopping at her face. She was new, freshly out of training and rising the ranks quickly. She gave him a kind yet wobbly smile. Officer Vari, if he remembered correctly. "It's been a long night," he answered, trying to return her wobbly grin, then he let out a soft chuckle. "After tonight, I think I'm going to need a month off." She chuckled slightly in response, and Tsukauchi reveled in the moment of peace they shared. "Now, let's see what Eraser needs." Straightening out his posture and putting on a calm facade was surprisingly easy for Tsukauchi. The precinct was currently on its night shift and the officers employed for this time were good at discretion. This was the crew that often dealt with underground heroes and more nefarious villains after all. He received and returned a few nods as he walked, but other than that, he and Officer Vari were left alone as they trudged to his office. She held the door open for him and he gave her a grateful smile. "He's on line 4, if you need anything just let me know," she said, matching his grin with a soft one of her own. "Thank you Vari-san, have a good night." With that, the door shut behind him. He walked towards his desk and began fiddling with the phone. It was an older design, one more similar to a landline and one he was still getting used to. He saw that line 4 had a red light beside the button, he pressed said button and held the phone to his ear. "Hello, this is Tsukauchi." "Hey detective. Took you long enough, how was the initial interrogation?" As always Shouda's voice echoed over the line. The slightest hint of teasing evident in its tone. He let out a long sigh. "Exhausting, she's severely mentally ill. She believed that she was helping Izuku, we only spoke long enough to solidify some charges and answer some of our more preliminary questions. We've got a lot more we still don't know and I'm hoping that maybe she can give us some answers." For now he was tired and legally it would be frowned upon to interrogate her further without a lawyer's presence. Actually he perked up at the man's tone, something odd he couldn't place was lacing his voice, "I might have some answers as well." His eyebrow quirked up at that. "Oh? Did Izuku say something?" "No, but his father did." What? What?" His mouth helpfully supplied. He heard as Awa let out a puff of air over the phone, he was sure the man was suppressing a snort. "Isashi Kurai just showed up at the hospital. He's a pro too, some underground hero in America. Apparently he just found out he had a kid. He's there. With you?" There was an edge of excitement in his voice. He couldn't help it, the short story fit with what he knew, he felt giddy when the strings of his cases began to weave together and make sense. He would need to speak with the man, to confirm his story and ask his own questions. What was his quirk? How did he find out about Izuku? How was his relationship with Inko? Was she always this twisted? No, he wanted to have a talk with Inko, the hero's voice pitched slightly off-kilter at the word talk. He shivered at the implication. He should be there in a couple of minutes if he hasn't shown up already, apparently flying is pretty quick. Flying? Show up here? Wait no. I'm sorry Eraser, I'm afraid I don't understand. He feigned ignorance, hoping maybe he had misunderstood and that Eraser hadn't decided to throw him under the bus like the cruel. I told him the location of the precinct, he's coming to speak with you, give his own statement and hopefully shed some light on the situation. Good luck. Cruel and sadistic asshole he was. God damn it as Awa he nearly shouted, you can't just pawn this off on me with barely a moment's notice. The long high tone disrupted his scolding. He hung up the phone, Eraser had hung up on him. That fucking asshole. The frantic knocking interrupted his insult. He couldn't help the obnoxious groan from leaving his throat. I'm going to kill him, I'm actually going to kill him. He slammed the phone back onto the receiver and stomped towards the door. Swinging it open, Sansa stumbled through the open doorway, panic staining his features. His fur puffed up and stood on edge. Sir. There's a hero here. The Black Dragon, sir, said that he's made arrangements to speak with you. Sansa uttered, words tumbling out of his mouth as he tried to right his stance. His pupils kept flickering between enlarged and slimmed, with a quick glance downwards, he saw that the man's claws were flexing in and outwards as well. Everything he was doing was displaying signs of pure instinctual fear. He forced his glare to disappear. Any frustration left from the phone call immediately melting away in favor of concern for his friend. It's alright Sansa, Eraser sent him. He tried to calm, the man relaxed a minuscule amount at that. Friend, he placed a hand on the man's shoulder and he flinched so hard Tsukauchi almost moved away. Why don't you head home for the night, it's well past your ordinary hours and you won't do us any good without rest. The officer heaved a couple of breaths before relaxing his posture. I'm alright. He's just big really big. Cat instincts and all that he gave the man's shoulder a tight squeeze. Even so, it's late, go home Sansa, I'll call if I need you. The man huffed an affirmative before leading Tsukauchi out of his office and towards the precinct's main foyer, a small area usually reserved for waiting families and surface-level social interactions. Taking up an impressive amount of space in the center was a titan of a man who watched with dark eyes as they entered the room. He had to have been well over 6 feet tall, his height matching or even exceeding that of Endeavor's. His build, though obviously muscled, wasn't as thick as the Flame Hero's. His muscles were more toned and lean, only accentuated by his body's natural behemoth size. He had black curly hair with a well-kept undercut ringing around his head, the black curls falling over it heavily. Where the curls ended by his ears, dark scales replaced it, his ears stretched with a dark shine in a less than human shade and shape. Probably the most striking features of the man lay in his obvious mutations. The most obvious of those being in the thick long reptile tail that thumped on the tiles and the folded scaled wings that decorated his back. Currently, the wings were pinned against his back, however he estimated that when opened, the wingspan would be well over 15 feet. Everything about him screamed predator, from his obvious physical mutations to the tilted head he used to examine Tsukauchi and his officer. He didn't blame Sansa for poofing up earlier, if he had fur, he was sure he would be doing the same. As it were, his arm and neck hairs were already standing on edge as goosebumps rattled across his frigid skin. He noticed faintly that Sansa had edged himself out of the room, leaving the detective alone with the man. Good, I hope he gets some sleep. Despite his instincts screaming at him to run. He stood his ground and further examined the hero. Black compression shirt and dark gray cargo pants, casual yet practical, easy to hide weapons. Larger than average hands, completely scaled sharp black nails. Talons. Claws. He wasn't sure exactly what they were, but they were different. Then up to the face. Surprisingly youthful cheeks, remnants of baby fat that likely never fully disappeared. Dark freckles that littered the entire face, smile lines around the eyes, worry lines on the forehead. Big, brown eyes now narrowed. Sharp teeth poking out from the lip, two metal rings digging in under his lower lip. A heaving exhale and a small puff of smoke, a long tongue flicked out to taste the smoke, rough looking and forked at the end. Oh. His mind flickered back to his conversation with Izuku, the sudden change of the appendage inside his mouth, and the flickering tips of the forked tongue as he wrapped it around pronunciations he used to be familiar with. A strange initial mutation, one that he shared with the man before him. Suddenly, the man's face stretched into a wide bright smile. Something that so easily contradicted his earlier demeanor it had Tsukauchi reeling with a whiplash. Ah hello detective. Tsukauchi, yes. I'm Hisashi Kurai. The man greeted, his voice deep and slightly rasped. He reached out a hand towards the detective, then paused and yanked it away before falling into an uncomfortably low bow. My apologies, it's been an awful long while since I've been in Japan. I'm afraid America may have rubbed off on me. The man looked almost sheepish, his cheeks dusted with light pink. For a moment, he was reminded of his first interactions with Izuku. His shy and polite nature, the sheepish way in which he apologized for something that didn't quite necessitate it. The endearing embarrassment that seemed to follow the boy around unfamiliar social interactions. He allowed a slight smile to pull at his lips. It's quite alright, sir. May I see your hero license? He asked the man, who scrambled up and began to pat down his pockets. Ah yes of course, here you are. The small leather wallet was thrust into his hands. He unfolded it and startled as several things tried to fall out of the open wallet, not secured in any of its pockets. He fumbled and managed to avoid dropping the folded paper and the card, which he realized was the man's hero license. He raised a brow as he made eye contact with the man. Kurai reached a hand up to scratch at his neck. Ah shit, sorry. I was rushing and he held up a hand to stop the man, letting his eyes rake over the license. After he deemed it legitimate, he tucked it into the open slot of the wallet and handed it and the folded paper back to the hero. He put on a more serious expression and made tentative eye contact with the hero. Everything looks to be in order, what do you need from me? The man took a moment to stuff his wallet back into his pocket before speaking. I'm here to speak with you about my son about Izuku Midoriya. True Racer had said that you were in charge of his case and told me to come to you but true. The hero continued to mutter, though at this point, his mutters had divulged into something unintelligible for the detective. He let out an amused sigh, again his mind forcing him to relive the parallels between this man and the teen. Kurai-san, before you say anything more, why don't you follow me to somewhere a bit more private, maybe then we can have an actual conversation. The hero's face reddened as he was jolted out of his mutters. He gave the detective another vibrant smile and straightened his posture. Of course, that would be much better than continuing to make a fool of myself here in the entrance. He let out an embarrassed chuckle. Tsukauchi couldn't stop his response of a chuckle of his own. Something about the man's personality straying so far from his appearance was almost endearing, it was amusing to say the least to see this titan act so sheepish. He led the hero through the precinct, he debated using an interrogation room, but decided against it, after all, the couches in his office would be much more comfortable for the both of them. He was not about to force the man to fit his tail and wings onto the tiny steel chairs of the interrogation rooms either. Actually, he was meaning to send an email in regards to the chairs anyways, you'd think in a society where mutations were so common a police precinct would at least be better prepared for them, alas, that was not the case. He sighed internally and led the hero into his office. He gestured towards the open couches off to the side and turned around to shut and lock the door. He figured that they'd both rather be uninterrupted. The hero took a seat on the couch against the wall and brought his tail up and into his lap, fiddling with the scales as he sat and waited for the detective. He took his time walking across his office, his steps lacking the urgency he felt. The scaled wings that seemed so large on the hero earlier seemed to be shrinking by the moment, getting smaller and smaller against his form. The hero caught him staring and twisted slightly to show off his wings. My wings are sort of retractable, they can fully disappear into scaled mounds on my back and grow back to full size in an instant. They take a couple minutes to shrink down. He explained. Tsukauchi watched the wings collapse into his shoulders. The compression shirt had 2 holes torn in the back where the wings must have ripped through. I suppose it would be rather inconvenient if they simply stayed at full size. Hawks like to complain about his own getting in the way. The man nodded in understanding. That used to be quite the issue when I was younger, they would pop out whenever I was surprised, or excited, or really happy, or angry or well pretty much during any big emotion. A lot of my younger years were spent just trying to stop them from popping out and slapping my classmates. The man told the story with a smile, his tone amused and slightly embarrassed. He felt himself relax at the personal story and took a seat on the armchair in front of the man. So, I have many questions, he started, but before I ask them, I'm hoping to hear your side of the story. I have a quirk that allows me to tell when someone is lying, so I'm able to personally verify your story. As further evidence, I will be recording this conversation. Kurai nodded in understanding. He paused for a moment, then let out a weary sigh. So Kurai, tell me what led you here today. He prompted after starting the recording. Another pause and a sigh. My name is Hisashi Kurai, true, I changed it when I graduated from high school and received my hero license. My previous surname was Tatsuma, true. He recognized the surname, though he wasn't sure where from. I wanted to protect mine and my family's identities, so I changed it before I took a job overseas. He paused and chuckled to himself. Now that I'm thinking about it, you probably know my sister, Ryuko, or as her dear fans call her, Ryukyu. She's how I found out about my kid about Izuku. True. All still true. The hero paused again, before wiping at his eyes furiously. I didn't know I had a son until a couple of weeks ago. True. The man took a moment, seemingly compassing himself, before sitting up straight and heaving out a long breath of heated air. Tsukauchi waited, still with bated breath. Around 16, almost 17 years ago now I believe. I was still a pretty young hero, I was 20 and stupid, and I got hurt pretty badly. True. The timeline matches with his hero license, no inconsistencies yet. That would make him 36 or 37 today, same age as me. That's how I met Inko, he continued. She was a nurse in the hero ward of the hospital at the time. She took care of me, nursed me back to health. She was my senior by almost 10 years, but we got along so well we decided to try dating despite the age difference. True. She was always kind and caring, doting on the people she loved. It was nice, but it got overwhelming. We argued a lot. She didn't like to see me hurt, but as a hero it was pretty much inevitable. She fretted over every little scratch and bruise. She tried to get me to quit heroics, she wanted me to settle down and get some cushy office job. That was kind of the last straw. We broke up a little after a year together and we haven't spoken since. All true. Everything he said so far lined up with the image of Inko Midoriya he had built up in his own brain. Being a pro was difficult, it strained your relationships, especially those with non-pros. It was rare that heroes could make a romantic relationship with a civilian work. Usually, they paired up with each other or no one at all. Tsukauchi only knew one pro who was currently in a relationship with a civilian, and that was Rock Lock. Inko didn't want the person she loved getting hurt, she must have really hated it if she would go as far as to ask him to quit being a hero. He could understand how that was the final straw for Kurai, still it didn't explain why she would go so far as to hide her son's existence. Unbeknownst to his internal conflict, Kurai continued, Ryuko was only 10 at the time, we've got different moms, but we were always close, she never liked Inko, but I figured she'd just forgotten about the relationship, kind of like I did if I'm being entirely honest. True. That answers my question about the age gap. The fact that this story included another pro would make everything easier to corroborate, however, trying to get an interview with one of the top 10 was not something he was looking forward to. We talk on the phone pretty often, and a couple months ago she called me, all excited and asked me to watch the first year's sports festival. I thought she found someone she wanted to grab as an intern or something. Tsukauchi knew where this was going, he'd seen both Izuku and his mother, he knew firsthand how alike they looked. He could imagine the confusion the hero must have felt seeing Izuku, especially once he realized the teen's age. Then I saw Izuku. He immediately made me think of Inko. The hero said the name of the woman solemnly, a smidgen of regret lacing his tone. I brushed it off at first, none of the quirks matched up, so I ignored it. But I couldn't get him out of my brain. Kurai paused again, taking a shaking breath, claws twitching around his tail. Telltale signs of stress, yet still his story remained truthful. Ryuko did some digging and found out that Izuku was Inko's kid. And that there wasn't a father in the picture. Things kind of snowballed from there. The room lapsed into silence. Tsukauchi let that silence fall. He could tell that the hero still had more to say and wasn't about to interrupt him. It was at least 30 seconds before either of them said a word. It was Kurai who opened his mouth again. I came here because a part of my family's genetics allows all of us dragon quirks to smell when someone is one of our own, well, blood related. True. Well, something like this was not unheard of in the world of quirks, it was certainly rare. Tsukauchi never ceased to be amazed by the intricacies of mutation quirks and how far some truly went into changing the physiology of a person while still being able to be considered technically human. It must be something scent-related, like a sort of pheromone. He'd read about pheromones before, even been forced to deal with them as explanations for some strange behaviors from certain heteromorphs around springtime. The idea had always seemed strange to him, but you couldn't deny biology. They would still have to do a DNA test, but that would be quick and easy. Yanking himself away from his internal monologue, he took care to notice the look of guilt on Kurai's face. The way he pursed his lips, the soft puffs of smoke that released at every exhale, the watery gleam in his eyes. I needed to know for sure, so that's why I am here. The hero huffed and made direct eye contact with Tsukauchi. I saw him. At the hospital. He looked so small. Fuck, and I haven't been here. I've missed so much. I have a son, he's my son Izuku, but fuck, I can't even call myself his father. A twisted sob ripped out of the man's throat, a wicked sound that had Tsukauchi's heart clenching. The hero ducked down, breaking eye contact and clawing at his face as tears streamed down it. What can I even do? What can I say? I don't know how to be a dad. I never got the chance to figure that out. The final word he almost choked out. His voice became warbelled and wet. I want to have custody of him. I want to take care of him. I want to be his dad. How can I even do that? He asked, and Tsukauchi finally took that as his turn to speak. First things first, we'd need an official DNA test, then we'd need to go about adding you to his birth certificate. The man looked up from his lap, staring at the detective with wide, wet eyes. Until then, Izuku, your son, the man gave him a grateful smile, as more tears slipped out of his eyes, will be in the custody of UA, with Shouta Izawa as his guardian. His homeroom teacher was the most likely candidate at least, though he was certain that Toshinori would give the man a run for his money. He ultimately knew that his friend did not have the capabilities to care for a teenager full-time, not when his own health was in such bad shape. Before anything else happened though, he needed to finish asking his questions. One look at the hero, however, had him pausing. The man sniffled wetly, and with that he supposed it wouldn't hurt to give him a few moments to compose himself before they continued. He made up his mind and took to his feet, pausing the recording in a simultaneous motion. Before anything else happens, I'm going to grab us some coffee. He stated, giving a soft smile to the hero, who returned it with an albeit wobbly smile of his own. And if he let that smile tug on his heart, then that was no one's business but his. He took a singular step and almost slipped before just barely catching himself on the armrest. Looking down curiously, he noticed with a shock that the man's tears had managed to create a small puddle on the floor of his office. Maybe they wouldn't need the DNA test after all. Sunlight streamed through the open windows of Izuku's hospital room. The window was held open a few inches, allowing a slight breeze to come through the screen and the sounds of chirping birds and humming car engines to seep into the room. Shouta came to consciousness the same way he had several other times that very night. But the startling jolt and an uncomfortable twinge in his neck from the strange position he was slumped in on the hospital chair. He blinked his eyes slowly, bringing a hand up to rub away the remaining sleep and ease the dull throbbing behind them. It had been well past midnight when he had finally dozed off, and even that crappy excuse for sleep was interrupted several times throughout the night. The hospital chair was not the most uncomfortable place he'd slept before, not by a long shot. But it still wasn't pleasant and granted his rest no favors. He raised his eyes to the bundle of blankets on the hospital bed, a soft snoring, almost rumbling noise emanating from the pile. Since Kurai had made his appearance and helped Izuku through his emotional crash, the boy had been all but dead to the world the rest of the night. The comparison sent a jolt of panic through him, and for probably the 20th time that night he reached over and grabbed Izuku's hand. He felt for a pulse and relaxed minutely when he felt blood pumping strongly beneath his fingers. This routine was repeated so often throughout the night that Shouta no longer had to search to find the pulse point, he immediately knew where it was and zeroed in on it. Izuku's left hand that was closest to him was one of the only parts of his body not enveloped by blankets, simply because his subconscious body had gotten tired of constantly tucking it back beneath the sheets and simply let it rest outside them, easily within Shouta's reach. as if a part of him knew the ease it would bring to his teacher. He dragged a hand over his face, suppressing his upcoming yawn, and stood from the chair with a muffled groan. He went through a few basic stretches, enough to ease the strain of his joints and feel his hips and back pop a dozen times until he was loose and comfortable. On the other side of Izuku's bed, another of the more comfortable hospital chairs was pulled up close beside it. The chair was currently vacant, though the jacket hung over the back and the bookmarked novel on the bedside table indicated that its owner had not gone far. That was another thing that changed last night. Now that Shouta was made aware of the relationship shared between Yagi and his student, the man seemed all the more willing to show that closeness. Shouta, however, would be a hypocrite to call out the man for it. He knew that his care for the teen had easily skyrocketed that very night as well. The idea of leaving his side was not within the realm of possibilities for Shouta, not when the very idea of being away from his problem child had his blood pressure sky high and his breaths coming in short gasps. Thus the two had sat in relative silence for the majority of the night at Izuku's bedside, only dutifully acknowledging each other when they both happened to have awakened at the same time. He was sure that Yagi had slept even less than himself. Judging by the position of the bookmarked page in the novel relative to the position he'd seen it in when the man had first taken out the book, that observation had been correct. He couldn't deny that he worried for the former hero. The man had run himself into the ground with his work and even now refused to slow down. Shouta had taken to carrying handkerchiefs for the man for when he had forgotten his own. He knew it wasn't much, but a part of him felt like he owed the man something for being the symbol of peace all these years. For carrying most of hero society on his shoulders alone. Bizashi and Nomuri, though originally teasing him about it, had taken to carrying some handkerchiefs as well for the former number one. The trend had spread and now the majority of the staff carried backups for the man. Even Shouta couldn't deny that the look on the former hero's face when he coughed and was presented with an option of 4 handkerchiefs from various staff members was hilarious, even more so when a similar situation repeated itself with the students. It was needless to say that the health of the man concerned him, and his apparent lack of sleep certainly didn't help that concern. Shouta would be a hypocrite to say anything himself, thus he had no intention of staging any sort of intervention for the former hero at this time. Maybe he could rope Hisashi and Nomuri into rallying the students to do it, the man would probably listen more if he had the begging eyes of Class 1A to influence him. His speculations were interrupted by an insistent buzzing from his pocket. From the moment he was conscious, it had been in his pocket sounding more akin to a hive of angry bees than anything. As much as he was dreading the onslaught of messages his phone must have received, he couldn't ignore the device any longer. Nezu needed an update, along with the rest of the staff. He bet a pretty penny on the fact that his students were likely harassing them for answers on the whereabouts of their friend and teacher. He couldn't stop the almost fond smile that came to his face at the idea of his students harassing his coworkers. It was only fair they had to deal with the problem children without him every once in a while. The particularly insistent buzz prompted his action. He glanced back at the sleeping teen once more. Seeing he was still unconscious, he gave the pulse a quick check, almost habit at this point, and took his phone out of his pocket. Immediately, he was greeted by 15 messages from Hisashi, 6 from Nomuri, 10 plus for the staff group chat, and over 20 from the Class 1A group chat. Temporarily ignoring all of those messages, he opened the one and only message from his boss. One new message from Ratbastard. Hisashi has threatened to show your class the pictures if you do not respond to him. I'll admit, I'm rather curious myself. He felt his face heat up, he knew exactly what pictures Hisashi had in mind, and he would never live it down if any member of his Hell class saw them. A brief flashback of the smell of alcohol and the scratchy texture of the dress he was wearing flashed across his mind, he shuddered at the memory. Fucking Nomuri and her fucking drunken dares. Without another moment, he opened his husband's messages and sent a quick text saying that he and Izuku were alright but in the hospital. He made sure to tell him not to tell the Hell class anything. If one of them found out, they all would, then he would have to deal with 19 students trying to sneak off the campus to check on them. Another message came from Nezu moments after he'd sent his response to Hisashi. Oh, and please tell the Black Dragon I said hello. Shouta took another moment to process that message. How the hell does the rat know everything? You know what did I even expect? He couldn't help the grimace that pulled on his lips. He wondered what else his boss already knew. Actually scratch that, Nezu probably already knew everything he did and more. Fucking hell, of course the rat already knows everything. Goddamn menace. Sensei. The soft voice interrupted his disgruntled spiel. He hadn't even realized he was speaking aloud until that interruption. Shouta stared at the pile of blankets on the hospital bed. The soft snoring that was previously filling the room had disappeared and the blankets had adjusted so that Izuku's green mop of hair was poking out along with the rest of his head. His wide green eyes stared at Shouta, then darted around the room, taking in the environment. He immediately stashed his phone back into his pocket. The rest of the world could wait. Without much more thought, he sat down and reached over to place his hand on top of Izuku's scarred own. He gave into a firm squeeze. "Hey problem child, how are you feeling?" he asked, taking care to keep his tone neutral. At the question, Izuku's face pinched and he began to roll his neck awkwardly. "Sore?" Shouda further asked and the teen nodded in response. "Figures, the doc said that would be normal for a while. Until your quirk is finished developing at least." The teen nodded his head in understanding and Shouda was hit with the sudden realization that Izuku thought his soreness was related to his overdose. Fuck, that's right. He doesn't know. In that moment, Shouda truly understood what his students meant by being saved by the bell, as before he had the chance to attempt an explanation, the hospital door began to creak open. Standing in the doorway in all of his skeletal glory was Yogi Toshinori. He was dressed differently than last night, changed into a dark green sweater and a pair of far too baggy jeans. He was holding in one hand a white plastic bag filled takeout and the other a drink tray carrying 3 large hot drinks. Shouda smelled coffee and almost felt himself begin to salivate. "Ah, young Izuku. You're awake." Yogi stepped through the entrance, his dramatic timing making up for the lack of his usual theatrics. "Hi All Might." Izuku greeted, his voice taking on an unusual almost growly tone, further reminding Shouda of the conversation he needed to have with the teen. Izuku brought a hand up to his throat and rubbed the flesh there awkwardly, his eyebrows pinched in confusion. Shouda met Yogi's eyes, and they shared a subtle moment of concern. The man's face dropped as he undoubtedly made the same realization Shouda had made only a few moments prior. Then, the man shook his head slightly, and all traces of earlier concern were gone. He smiled and raised both arms as he stepped further into the room. "I brought breakfast," he said, his voice slightly softer now. Shouda admired the careful way the man held himself, the graceful steps he took as he set the bag down on the nightstand, the way that even now doing something so menial, he was able to command the attention of the room. He was giving Shouda and himself time to collect their thoughts, to formulate a plan and compartmentalize their emotions. Again, the pro found himself feeling grateful for the former number one. "Good. Coffee?" Shouda asked once the bag was set down. Yogi chuckled in response. "Yes, and some tea for you, my boy," he stated, holding the tray over the bed for Shouda to take his drink. Shouda stood and grabbed one of the coffees and Izuku's tea from the tray, he held it out the teen who sat up and took it gratefully, the blankets bunching around his waist, showing off the black sweater he'd borrowed from his teacher earlier. Shouda saw the red and blue of the blanket Yogi had given him and had to suppress the smile, threatening to command his features. He wasn't sure if the teen knew, but he was currently cozying up with possibly some one-of-a-kind All Might merch provided by the hero himself. He knew for a fact that if Izuku was aware, he would have refused to use the blanket on principle of keeping it pristine like his other merch. The teen sat up a bit more and wrapped both his hands around the cup, letting out a rumbly sigh as he just held the beverage for a moment. "That should help with your throat, kid." The teen hummed in agreement and took a sip of his tea. Shouda followed his example, taking a sip of his coffee. It took an immense amount of self-control not to immediately spit it out as he realized with dismay that the former number one had gotten him black coffee. Moments like these were when Shouda despised his hard-ass exterior, moments where people assumed he liked his coffee as black as his clothing. His Ashi drank his coffee black, in fact he drank straight-up espresso. Shouda, however, did not. He had a sweet tooth that was only satisfied by the quite frankly unhealthy amounts of sugar he took in his coffee, one that somehow no one managed to pick up on despite his food of choice being disgustingly sweet fruit jelly packets. He choked down the black coffee and Yogi shot him a curious glance. Something must have dawned on him because in the next moment the man was handing over the drink tray that Shouda now noticed had a section of it filled with sugar packets and individual servings of cream. The man himself grabbed 2 of each, dutifully looking away as Shouda grabbed 2 cream and 4 sugar packets. The older man held the tray towards Izuku. "Izuku, would you like any sugar for your—" "What's going to happen to me?" the teen interrupted. Destroying the smooth road that the two men were relying on to ease tension. The room went silent. Izuku's eyes were tilted downwards, avoiding the looks of the two men. He took a shuddering breath and sipped at his tea. His face twisted into something bitter and strangely youthful. I mean, well I know that my mom did something bad, but she's a good mom. And she really loves me." It almost sounded like a question the way Izuku spoke it and Shouda felt his blood boil. Yogi looked heartbroken. Izuku continued, "It was probably just like headache pain meds, right? Or, maybe sedatives. To help me sleep, right? But there were too many. It was an accident, right?" "Fuck no kid, no. Quirk suppressants." The teen snapped his head up to stare at Yogi slack-jawed, eyes brimming with unshed tears. Shouda's eyes followed before darting back to stare at his student. There were a few moments of quiet while both men watched Izuku's eyes dart back and forth as he tried to connect the dots. He jolted and stared at the former number one with wide eyes. But the Quirk? He asked, and Shouta realized again how behind the teen was in their previous night's discoveries. They weren't suppressing one for all. He interrupted the impromptu staring contest, a look of panic erupted on Izuku's face as he turned to look at his teacher. He squeezed his hand gently. "It's okay kid, Yagi and the detective told me. I'm not mad. At you," were the words that Shouta left unspoken. An expression of relief washed over Izuku's face. Then he slumped over more on the bed. Then, he jumped up with a smile, a wild almost manic look in his eyes. So they didn't work then. I can still use one for all, so that must have meant that they didn't work. No harm no foul right? So she didn't actually do anything wrong right? I mean suppressants don't even matter when there is nothing to suppress right? The teen paused when he looked up at his teachers, something on their faces must have stopped him. My boy Yagi startled, reaching over to place a comforting hand on Izuku's arm, his smile fell, "You were never meant to be quirkless." The words seeped into every corner of the room, words that held a meaning that would uproot Izuku's very life, very being. Shouta didn't fully understand the significance of them, he couldn't, but he could feel the betrayal, he could imagine how they could and would affect the teen before him. He expected crying, that the teen would immediately burst into tears and start wailing, maybe even pass out again from exhaustion. He expected yelling, screaming, anger and weeping. What he didn't expect was nothing. Izuku something in his eyes seemed to crack. He just froze. He didn't say a word, his hand fell limp beneath Shouta's. He gave it another squeeze, but it garnered no response. He seemed to barely even breathe, like his breath was lodged in his throat. His normally vibrant green eyes now looked more gray than anything, dull and dead. The look sent a spike of panic through Shouta before he felt the hand of the teen twitch beneath his own. He let out an almost unconscious sigh. That relief that Izuku was alive was unfortunately not dulling his current worry at the teen's sullen expression. They gave the teen a few more moments of nothing, hoping maybe that it would hit, that he would start to cry and sob, but that light would come back to his eyes. That he would tell them how he felt, or rather show them, so they could help. Instead, the teen gave them nothing. You were never meant to be quirkless. What? That couldn't be right. There was no way. Take a swan dive off the roof and pray for a quirk in your next life. No, someone without a quirk can't be a hero. Useless Izuku. When are you gonna give up, huh? All this? Are you really even human if you don't have a quirk? Someone like you could never be a hero. Give up already. Oh Izuku, I'm so sorry. A waste of space. A nuisance. Useless. Worthless. Deku. Was for nothing. He couldn't process it. He just couldn't. Everything was foggy, no blurry, actually maybe it wasn't real. That would make more sense. Maybe he was dreaming, or maybe he really had died. Maybe she had killed him. No, he was alive. He could feel the gentle buzz of one for all beneath his skin, feel the power just beneath his fingertips. But it wasn't his, was it? He didn't have one. He didn't have a quirk, he was the quirkless, useless, annoying Deku. Deku kind of sounds like you can do it. Don't you think? By Deku isn't always going to mean useless, from now on Deku is the name of a hero. Everything seemed to contradict itself. You were never meant to be quirkless. You know Izuku kind of looks like Deku on paper, and that means useless. A useless, worthless, nothing. A Deku. No. All this time? After everything? He had a quirk. Not one for all, not the one he was given by All Might, but his own quirk. I want you to show the world I am here. Make this quirk your own, young Midoriya. What even was it? Was it like his mom's quirk, telekinesis? Or was it more like his dad's fire-breathing? Wait, no, there was more, there wasn't it? He couldn't quite remember why just fire-breathing felt wrong, after all, that's what his mom told him all these years. I was worried you didn't smell right, but it is you, isn't it, Lil Spark? Oh yeah, his dad was back, he was back, and he was a hero. His quirk made him like a dragon. Yes. He remembered. But what about Mama? He must have been deep inside his own head because he barely registered the presence of the two men in the room, even as their hands held onto him. He barely even looked up when he felt another hand come up and brush his hair out of his face. It was only when he felt that same warm, calloused hand cup his cheek and turn his face that the fog around him began to fade. His face was close to his teacher's, to Izawa-sensei's. He was squeezing his cheek and talking to him, an unusual softness taking over his usually gruff tone. At first Izuku couldn't make out what he was saying, he just watched the man's eyes, searching for something neither of them quite knew. The man's face tightened, and his eyes portrayed worry. Izuku was confused, why was he worried? Was someone hurt? Were they okay? He felt his hand being lifted off of the bed and felt as it was placed against the hero's chest. It was warm, and a soft badum behind the chest brought him further out of the fog. "There you go kid," Azawa's voice finally seeped through the fog, a certain gentleness that wasn't usually there now showing through. "Come back to us now, okay? Can you feel my heartbeat?" He nodded against the man's hand, everything, but Azawa seemed so distant. "Good, focus on that for me, okay?" He thought about nodding again, but didn't want to move his head away from the man's warm hand. Instead, he opened his mouth and shut it a couple of times before answering with a soft "okay sensei." Azawa's eyes positively lit up with that, and he could have sworn he saw a slight uptake in his lips before they dropped back into a neutral expression. "Okay problem child, can you tell me where we are right now?" he asked Izuku. The question confused him. They were at home, weren't they? He was on a bed. Wait, no, it must have been school, the school infirmary, yeah. No, that wasn't right either, and it wasn't the dorm, so, then where were they? His chest began to tighten. Hey no, it's okay, just follow my breathing, alright kid? Just keep following me. He'd never heard his teacher sound so soft before. It was confusing but nice. He tried to listen to the man, to match his steadily quickening breaths with the even ones of his teacher, as the man kept the fog receding to the edge of his vision. "Good job Izuku, just like that. Can you try again for me?" As his breaths evened, he took another moment to think. He glanced around, at the bed, at the walls, at the IV drip by the bed. "Oh. We're at the hospital." He swallowed. "Mistafu General Hospital, right?" The hero nodded, his eyes crinkling. You brought me here, you and All Might-san." This time, the uptake of the man's lips wasn't his imagination. "That's right kid, it's just past 9 am. And you, me, and Yagi were talking about some things." Azawa seemed hesitant to continue. He glanced away for a moment and something behind Izuku seemed to steel his nerves. "Do you remember what we were talking about?" Izuku paused again, thinking. The memories trickled in less like a train wreck this time and more like a soft, steady stream, like Azawa was literally holding his brain from collapsing, letting him process the memories more comfortably. We were talking about what happened to me." The hero nodded, so Izuku continued. You guys just told me that mom that she made me quirkless." He couldn't get the next words out, they felt like glass in his throat. Cutting his esophagus and filling his mouth with blood. Suddenly the metaphor became too real as a sudden urge to vomit overwhelmed his system. He wrenched his head away from Izawa's hand and started gagging, trying to get the phantom taste of blood out of his mouth. He gagged and coughed, feeling as something seemed to pop and dislodge within his throat. He retched more as he felt something slimy and foreign crawling its way up his insides. The phantom sensation became stronger, and to the entire room's horror, bloody splatters began to fly out of Izuku's mouth with each retch. With a violent gag, blood spewed from Izuku's mouth all over the sheets of the bed. Something pinkish red and strangely fleshy came out with it. The sight only made his nausea worse, and he forced his eyes shut with a whine. Faintly, he registered the worried voice of Azawa shouting at someone to get a nurse. All other words faded away as he fought to keep his focus on the firm hand rubbing circles in his back and squeezing the base of his neck reassuringly. He coughed up a couple more strange fleshy bits. Was he dying? He imagined what a horror scene the hospital sheets must have resembled, but he didn't dare open his eyes again. He knew the sight of his own blood would be too much for him and would set off more gagging. The metallic smell clung to his nose, the coppery taste overwhelming everything else. But there was nothing in his throat anymore, nothing phantom or real. He took a few shuddering breaths and leaned back into Azawa's hand. He felt disgusting. I'm okay, sensei. I'm okay." His teacher let out an unexpected snort but quickly cleared his throat. "I'd love to believe you, problem child, but it literally looks like you just vomited your guts out. Forgive me if I'm a tad skeptical." At this, Izuku let out his own snort, his throat felt raw and something in his chest felt weirdly empty, but he didn't feel like he was on the verge of death, he just felt well gross. A few moments of quiet followed, every once in a while reassuring words being uttered from Azawa's mouth. Izuku tried to keep himself listening, but being present was difficult when he still felt his consciousness teetering in and out of that fog. At the moment, it overwhelmed him. He stopped fighting it. He needed to stop thinking about how fucked up his body may have been. A new hand on his back forced a jolt out of the teen. Azawa shushed him gently with a firm squeeze on his shoulder. He felt so vulnerable with his eyes shut, but he resolutely refused to open them. The hand was strangely cold, abnormally so, it almost felt like Todoroki had touched him with his right hand and sent a trail of frost running down his spine. He shivered at the feeling and tried to zone in on the words being exchanged by the new person and his teacher. He caught only every third word, but based on the words, quirk, rejection, new, lung, and mutations, a pretty picture was not being painted. His quirk was doing this. And he thought breaking bones was bad. His mind wandered back to earlier that night, back to his father. He remembered the shiny black scales, thick tail and the puffs of smoke he'd released from his mouth. The strange ears and sharp canines. His father's quirk was a mutation quirk, one that likely came about slowly and naturally once he turned 4. Izuku's hand. His body had developed as if he was quirkless this whole time. If he had, or was supposed to have a similar mutation quirk then all of his mutations would be coming in now. Raging his way through his already developed body, destroying anything it needed to replace. Ripping him apart inside and out until his body was right. Fuck, and he thought growing pains had hurt if he was going to grow a tail. Shit, maybe he was just overthinking it, but he swore his tailbone and spine were starting to ache already. And the teeth. No wonder he'd had constant toothaches his whole life. He had a whole other set of them. His mind couldn't seem to decide between freaking out over the likely pain he was about to experience and nerding out over his own quirk and the signs he'd been missing his whole life. A sudden, very urgent question entered his mind. Oh my god. Am I going to breathe fire? He was suddenly brutally aware of the silence coating the room. Then, completely shocking everyone including himself, he began to giggle. Oh my fuck, I just coughed out my own fucking lung. What the fuck, haha, of course my quirk is going back and replacing my organs. That's so fucking typical, haha. Oh. He was wheezing now, still hunched over what he now knew was his literal lung. The room was still silent. He felt the sudden urge move he needed to get up. What was that awful ringing? Ah. He snapped his eyes open and shot his head up. The first sight to meet his own being the extremely concerned face of his mentor, who was standing in front of the bed with a hand reaching out as if to touch Izuku. He was saying something, Izuku could tell by the movements of his mouth, but he couldn't hear anything. Not anything but that awful ringing. He felt himself crack at the sight of his hero. He jumped forwards, pushing right through the tugging hands of his teacher and the nurse. He gripped All Might's hand and tumbled forwards into him, his giggling faltering and falling into heavy sobs as the arms of his mentor caught him. He heaved in breath after aching breath as he wailed. His body aching in new pains and his emotions tearing at the seams. Nothing to distract him but that horrid ringing and the warmth of his hero. All Might simply held him tightly, despite the snot and tears seeping into his shirt, despite the likely uncomfortable weight of the superpowered teen in his hands. Despite, or maybe because of the fact that he knew his boy was only holding on by a thread. He ran a hand through the teen's tangled green curls. He paused his murmured praises as he felt something hot and wet by Izuku's ear. He lifted his hand and stared at the dark blood in horror. The boy was muttering as he sobbed into his chest, like he couldn't even hear himself. Could he? The quirk is starting with his internal body systems. He briefly heard the nurse explain. He'll likely have heightened hearing, so his body is destroying the redundant and useless pieces. So it can replace them. How long will it take? As Awa inquired, Toshinori didn't hear the answer, he was too busy trying in vain to comfort his boy. He began to whimper and hiccup little noises. The boy, because that's what he was, just a boy, had never sounded so pained. Is there anything you can do? The former hero asked, his voice shaking almost as much as he was. As Awa looked at the nurse with a similarly hopeful expression, Toshinori glanced down and saw the man's hands covered in blood. She gave them a regretful look, then dropped her sympathetic gaze to the quivering teen. We can only wait until it passes on its own. The teen sobbed again, Toshinori felt his arms tighten at the sound. As Awa's gaze dropped to his own hands, his eyes wide, pupils quivering. The former hero resisted the urge to hug his coworker close as well, their kinship growing by the second as they acted as Izuku's caretakers. He looked down at the teen again, his face hidden into his sweater, his green mop of hair almost blending in with the plush fabric. He couldn't imagine the pain his boy must have been in to be making such sounds and be holding him so close without worry. The idea of it being anywhere even close to what he experienced when his own organs were destroyed caused him a violent shiver, the barley their embers of one for all, stirring deep inside of him as his very core ached to help. Maybe he couldn't hold all of Japan together anymore, but maybe, just maybe, he could keep his boy from falling apart. The next few hours were a blur of motion and a snail's race at the same time. As Awa had stepped out of the room to catch up the rest of the staff with the teen situation and check in on the police investigation. Tsukauchi had been sending Toshinori frequent updates throughout the night, several of them giving details on the man called Kurai, who claimed to be Izuku's biological father. After his interview with the detective, said man had retreated back to his sister's, Ryukyu. Who would have thought? Apartment for what remained of the night. Rather unfortunately, Tsukauchi bemoaned, the man was not allowed to see Izuku until they had hardcore proof of the relationship. Toshinori was relatively relieved at that knowledge, not that he hadn't wanted Izuku to have his father there with him. It was simply that he wasn't sure how to react to seeing him, and with what they'd learned of Izuku's mother, how she had seemed so sweet, he would never understand. He didn't think he'd be able to trust his successor with anyone new anytime soon. Privately, in the depths of his mind, a small voice argued that the true reason he was grateful for Kurai's absence was that he was worried he was to be replaced. He'd always seen the boy much like a son, and the idea of anything intruding on that brought great sadness and a pang of anger that he was almost certain was entirely misplaced. After all, Izuku having his father was a good thing, yes. That it was good, he was certain of that. He wasn't. The idea that Izawa likely had similar feelings to him in regards to the boy was not unknown to Toshinori. However, he'd trust that man with his and Izuku's lives 1,000 times over, so the idea did not plague him, it actually managed to comfort him somewhat. Knowing that someone he trusted was just as willing to take care of and nurture the boy was something that warmed his heart greatly. There they were, both of them far too close to the ground. His boy's face devoid of color and of life, his body jolting uselessly and Izawa's folded hands punched into his heart, forcing it to beat. He heard a sickly crunch and registered faintly that Izawa was sobbing as he performed the aggressive CPR, muttering almost intelligible begs that the teen stay alive and stay with him. The memory from only a few hours sprung on him painfully. He'd never seen Izawa so distressed, it had been horrifying to see the usually calm man reduced to such emotion. The whole world had turned upside down within one night. All he was really certain of was that this night had been hell incarnate. He would suffer through 1,000 more battles with All For One if it meant he'd never see Izuku or Izawa like that ever again. He had been so useless in the moment, he tried to tug Izawa away to help the paramedics get to the teen, but his small form was much too weak to even budge the hero. He'd not even been able to assist in carrying the stretcher, no, he was confined to just watching as the hero fought tooth and nail to save his boy's life. He felt the embers of One For All tug and hiss at him, the quirk itself seeming to keep Izuku alive. If the green lightning that raked over his body at the use of the defibrillator was anything to go by, that was an accurate assumption. Even now, he felt so useless, so weak. Izawa had been doing most of the heavy lifting despite his obvious need for rest. He hadn't been blind to the traumatic responses the pro seemed to be exhibiting, the way he jolted up out of nowhere at least 12 times throughout that night just to check Izuku's pulse. Even just before he left the room, as if it were a habit by now to just take the boy's hand, feel for a pulse, and give a slight nod to no one in particular before he had left. It had been confusing, it had been understandable, and it had been heartbreaking to see the paranoia the homeroom teacher was fighting against. Anyone who even dared to imply the man didn't care about his students would receive nothing but disdain from Toshinori, that was certain. All the while, all he could do was hold Izuku. He held the teen as his bed sheets were cleaned and replaced, he held him as the nurse poked and prodded at his ears, wiping away blood and pulling out chunks of skin and flesh with tweezers, setting them in a metal tray to be sent to the lab. There was an absurd amount, and at one point, the pieces seemed to resemble soft fatty tissue, rather than what was expected from the ear canal. He tried not to think about what that may have meant, about how the ears were an almost direct route to the brain, and how they might have been pulling pieces of dead brain tissue out of his successor's ears. No, he tried not to think about it, he just held his boy close to his chest. At that point, he was unsure if he was more reassuring Izuku or himself. Either way, Izuku didn't seem to mind. Throughout the entire ordeal, the boy had stayed grasping close to him, his whole body limp save for the strong arms wrapping around his mentor. He'd continually been letting out small whines and whimpers, even seeming to pant occasionally as the flesh was removed from his ears. The entire time, the boy kept his eyes pressed tightly closed. The stream of steady tears decorating his face, a familiar but heartbreaking sight. The tears themselves clued them in on the next change from Izuku's quirk. Instead of just salty water leaking from his tears ducts, as time went on, the tears began to thicken and seep from his whole eyelid, rather than just the corners. A slow and steady drawl of a sort of watery goo that smeared onto Toshinori's shirt before anyone had noticed. He paid the stain nearly no mind and with gentle hands, tugged the boy's face slightly away from smothering himself in his sweater. His forehead glistened with sweat and he huffed out a heaving breath as his head was leaned back and examined by his mentor. By that point, the nurse had moved on from his ears, content that he'd removed all of the dead tissue and was sending the metal tray away with another nurse. Toshinori glanced at the now ajar door and saw Izawa standing outside of it, leaning against the wall with his fingers flying across his phone screen. A pinched expression that could mistaken as simple annoyance brushed across his features. He looked about as exhausted as Toshinori felt. He turned his attention away from the pro and back to the shivering boy in his arms, his face still cradled in his hands, one petting upwards to scratch at the teen's scalp. The boy let out a groan and leaned into the touch, eyes still pressed shut, the liquid from his eyes now taking on a ruddy yellow with bits of red. The nurse had a pitying expression on his face. He stood and left the two together on the hospital bed. He heard the sound of running water and before long the man had come back with a small bowl filled with warm water and a damp cloth. The nurse offered the cloth to Toshinori and he took it graciously before bringing his complete attention back to Izuku. He ran his free hand through the green hair and let out a deep breath. His thin fingers untangling a knot with patient care. Izuku, my boy, can you hear me? The teen let out a high simpering whine and slammed both of his hands onto his ears, effectively stopping his tight grip on his mentor but still melting into his touch. He nodded his head minutely, then let out a whimper before trying to tuck his face back into Toshinori's sweater. He held the boy's cheek firmly and began to wipe away the red yellowish pus that seeped from his left eye. At hurts the two words trailed off into another moan of pain. He couldn't help the slight smile cracking his features. Those were the first words the boy had muttered in over an hour. They weren't much, but he was grateful for anything. He again scratched the boy's scalp and switched to wiping the space under the right eye. The pus here had red tints in it instead of just the yellow. He forced himself to ignore the curling in what was left of his stomach and started to hum what he hoped was a soothing tune. "You're doing so well, my sweet boy, just keep being strong, okay?" The teen nodded again, and the former hero felt his eyes crinkled before his smile fell once more. It was strange, he hadn't realized how taxing the simple act of smiling had been until he no longer had to worry about his persona. He hadn't realized how much brighter and more natural his smiles became when they weren't something plastered on his face 24/7. Yet another way his time as All Might continued to slip away from him. Damn it. He pulled away again and continued to wipe the seeping pus and blood from both eyes, taking care to get close enough to his eyes to properly clean him, but trying to make sure he kept them from becoming even more irritated. The flow had begun to slow, and Toshinori couldn't help his sigh of relief as the liquid became thinner and less opaque, the small amount mixing with the tears and allowing Toshinori to wipe them away without further skin agitation. The nurse cleared his throat at the sight and moved back towards the teen. Two nylon gloves snapping over his hands. "Hello Izuku, I'm here to help you." The nurse started, his voice taking on a soft but bright tone. "Can you open your eyes and turn to me please? If you can't see right now that's perfectly alright." Izuku nodded and moved slightly away from Toshinori's grip. The former hero moved back as well, leaving one hand resting in Izuku's hair, so the teen knew he hadn't left. He stood by the nurse and watched Izuku's face tense as he tried to pry his eyelids open. The boy's hands were still firmly planted over his ears, so the fact that he still seemed to understand them perfectly clearly showed Toshinori that the boy's hearing must have improved. He winced at the idea of the teen interacting with Bakugo like this or most of his classmates, rather than he quickly swept away the idea. Right now, they had to take things one crisis at a time. Besides, maybe Shoji or Jiro would have tips to help him get used to the new onslaught of senses once they were able to explain away this new quirk at least. Shit. How had that slipped his mind? There was no way anyone would buy the excuse that this was just a new manifestation of superpower. That would have been a ridiculous notion to even the dullest of people. He grabbed those worries and shoved them deep into his mind. He knew he would have to confront these worries soon, likely far sooner than he wanted to. For now however, Izuku needed him and he needed to put his full attention and care towards making sure his boy was safe and protected. He scratched at the teen's scalp again and the boy relaxed ever so slightly at the gesture. He let out a shaking exhale, more whimper than anything. And slowly began to pry his eyes open. When his eyelids finally slid away, Toshinori couldn't stop the violent nausea that slammed into him. Izuku's eyes and pupils were almost completely gone. It was like they had melted out of his eye sockets. A thin-looking membrane was slid over the gap where the center of his eye had been, and a strange fluid seemed to be building up behind them that resembled the fluid of a green glow stick. He barely resisted the urge to gag. Izuku's breath hitched. I can't see, All Might, I can't, where are you?" the teen gasped as Toshinori cupped his cheek, his own breath hitching while he held his boy. "Shh my boy, it's alright. I'm right here, I'm right here." His eyes were suspiciously wet and he had to consciously force his breathing into submission rather than the full-blown panic attack trying to overtake him. "Alright Izuku." The nurse continued, "It looks like everything is going smoothly. Could you lean your head back for me kid? I'm going to give some eye drops. Your vision should be back within the hour." Toshinori jumped up, a jolt of excitement rushing through him. Really that soon? He was shot a dampening glare, causing a sheepish smile to present on his face. Yes. His internal mutations are developing at an alarming but consistent speed, it's likely your body has been preparing for them for a long time. Byasu-san used his quirk to flush the rest of the drugs out of your system and must have kick-started them. He explained. One gloved hand holding Izuku's chin slightly elevated, the other administering the eye drops. "Now blink for me please." Izuku complied, then let the lids fall again with a satisfied sigh. These eye drops are enhanced by a regeneration quirk and should help speed along the process. He gave what he hoped came across as a grateful smile before he returned all of his focus onto Izuku. He was still trembling, but his breaths were coming easier. The shaking in his chest had diminished. Everything was loud, so loud. But he was able to manage it now, he was already getting used to the constant new stimulus his ears were filling him with. It was exciting, it was terrifying. And it hurt. His eyes, he meant. They were stinging and there was a persistent pressure behind his eyelids and going deep into his head. All he had seen when he opened his eyes was blinding white light and he was almost ashamed of how quickly he'd panicked. He'd completely forgotten about the hand on his head and immediately stressed about the location of his mentor. The sense of relief when he heard his voice and felt his hands again was almost as relieving as the news that his sight would be back within the hour. He wondered what everything would look like. Would his eyesight be sharper? Would he be able to see farther? Maybe his eyes had even developed new color receptors and he'd be able to see completely unique colors. Would he be able to see different waves of light? Would he be able to see heat signatures like infrared vision? He was oh so curious and was rifling through any and all information he had on the eyesight of lizards and cold-blooded creatures, which thanks to his proneness to fall into deep internet dives, was a decently large amount. There was also the chance that his eyesight wouldn't resemble that of any normal cold-blooded lizard or that it was some sort of unique mixture. After all, it was a quirk based on the physiology of a dragon, a fictional mythological beast. Would his eyes be the same color? Would his pupils look the same? Would they? His mental tangent was interrupted by the booming laugh of All Might and a heavy clap on the shoulder. He couldn't help the large flinch and wince at the louder than usual laugh and sudden extra contact. Thankfully, All Might seemed to notice and the hand on his shoulder gave a firm squeeze. "Oh my boy. It's nice to hear you muttering like your usual self." His face heated up, blood rushing to his head at an alarming speed. "Oh shit, I said all that out loud didn't I?" Another booming laugh and he promptly slapped a hand over his mouth. "Yes, Izuku. You did say all that out loud." He could practically hear the smile in the man's voice and he felt a weary grin tug at his own lips. The hand on his shoulder traveled inwards and started to rub small circles into his lower neck and upper back, the gentle warm pressure helping to further relax his body. He hummed into it and was surprised when the hum came out lower and more growly than expected. The sound rumbled inside of him and sent a pleasant vibrating sensation throughout his entire body, allowing waves of calm buzzing to ease his nerves and aching muscles. The rubbing hand sent his memory back to his earlier episode, where instead of the larger-than-life hand spanning a large amount of his shoulder blades, it was his teacher's regular-sized calloused hands that tried to ease him through his panic. Where was he now? Was he still in the room with them and just keeping silent? No. He wasn't in the room. Izuku was certain that it was currently just him, All Might and the nice nurse. He'd always had a knack for knowing who was in the room with him, and as he paid closer attention, he realized that most of his gut feelings had actually stemmed from vague odors he picked up around the room. Was this a part of his quirk? He'd never thought too deeply into it before, but now it seemed like he was questioning everything. Was he angry with Izuku for getting so emotional? Or maybe he'd gone back to the dorms to take care of his classmates. Maybe he had patrol. He wasn't quite sure of the time anymore, and he wouldn't have been too shocked if most of the day had already passed. He got like that when he was emotional, losing track of time and allowing it to slip past him in large unrecognizable chunks of amnesia. Is Izawa-sensei here? He felt himself ask before he had actually made up his mind on if he would. The hand pressed more firmly and All Might began to chuckle beside him. "He's just in the hall, my boy. Nedzu needed an update and I'm sure your friends have been worried sick and pestering him." It felt like a bolt of lightning ripped through him. A sudden flash of blonde, explosions. The faint scent of caramel. Oh god. All Might. He jolted upwards, unbeknownst to him only barely avoiding smacking All Might in the face as he reached around and grasped at the man desperately. "Izuku. What is it?" The team's response breathed a healthy dose of fear into both of their hearts. "Ha-chan." All Might's hand stilled on his back as a thick fog of tension layered over the room. We were supposed to spar tonight, or well, last night after I got back from my mom's." He brought his hands together in front of him, mindlessly picking at his nails. I can't believe I missed sparring with Kachan." There was a long pause and Izuku heard the man suck in a breath, the hand on his back twitched. "My boy," All Might started, "I don't think. He's going to be so mad." Izuku couldn't stop himself from interrupting everything, but his own thoughts seemed so disconnected. We just started to fix things and now I ruined it." The room fell into silence again. He felt an aching sob build up in his throat, it came out as a pathetic sounding cry and he began to fold in on himself. He and All Might were sitting on the hospital bed, side by side. Izuku's legs were dangling off the bed, swinging aimlessly. In a flurry of movement, he brought his knees up to his chest and hugged them inwards, tiny sobs shaking his body. He could feel the man's body heat right next to him and he felt a sudden urge to just bury himself in it. He found himself leaning into his mentor's side, the hand on his back reaching to tuck itself around his shoulders. Pulling him closer. He felt another sob tumble out of his throat and tucked his head into All Might's side. With his arm planted firmly around Izuku, his hero held him close as he cried. The tears at this point mostly used up from the sheer amount of fluids he'd lost. There was an awkward shuffling on the bed before his mentor uttered a small thank you to someone other than Izuku. It was only a moment later that he felt something small and plastic being pressed against his lips. He parted them and began to suck up the water greedily through the straw, not realizing how thirsty he was until the cool liquid pressed against his dry tongue. The motions of drinking felt strangely foreign to him, his tongue wrapping awkwardly around the straw, but he adapted swiftly, drinking as much as he could before the straw made a loud slurping noise against the bottom of the empty bottle. He let out a sigh of relief and let his head fall into All Might's chest, the soft rises and falls of the man's chest, helping to further calm him. After a few more moments of quiet, he felt the man adjust slightly against his side, one of his hands making a home in Izuku's curls. "Izuku, my boy, you haven't ruined anything, okay?" He nodded against his hero's side, not really believing him. All Might seemed to pick his hesitancy up and continued to speak, his fingers tracing soft circles along his upper arm in almost mindless patterns. "Young Bakugo will surely understand why you were unable to spar with him. I believe he's more worried about your well-being than anything." The hand around his shoulders gave him a firm squeeze, forcing a strained laugh past Izuku's lips. "Hachin? Worried?" The notion seemed ridiculous. He couldn't imagine the teen being worried about anyone, let alone about him. Again, All Might seemed to understand the words left unspoken as the arm around Izuku tightened and the man let out a weary sigh. "Bakugo Shounen cares about you, Izuku, that's why he wants to spar with you." His tone left no room for argument and honestly, Izuku didn't think he could have argued with it even if he wanted to. Hachin didn't do things if he didn't want to, if he hated Izuku and didn't care about him, there was no way he'd be willing to spar with him twice a week. There was no way he'd even remotely indulge his murmured rambles, no way he'd be okay with Izuku joining in on his study sessions or allow him to be dragged to weekly movie nights with the rest of the class. There was no way he didn't care whenever he made katsudon, he always accidentally made too much and demanded that Izuku have it so it wouldn't go to some extra who couldn't handle the spice because he knew that Izuku's spice tolerance rivaled his own. He knew the Kachin cared because of course Izuku knew. He knew Kachin. He knew that whatever their relationship was, it wasn't a hateful one, at least not anymore. Maybe it had been at one point, but those times had passed and he'd grown so much since then. They both had. So sure, he couldn't imagine Kachin sitting around worrying about him like a normal person, but he could accept the fact that the explosion Quirk teen did care. And maybe, just maybe he was being just a tad dramatic in the reaction he expected from his friend. Friend? Rival? Classmate? Acquaintance? He wasn't sure how to respond to All Might's words. His feelings were so complicated that he was certain if he tried to speak on it, all that would come out would be word vomit. So instead of speaking, he just nodded his head before sinking deeper into All Might's side, reveling in the warmth the man gave off. He smelled faintly of pine, likely a cologne, and Izuku soaked in the scent of it. Something about it was so fitting of his hero. There was a faint coppery smell as well, though he wasn't sure if that was a remnant of the blood he himself lost earlier or if it was a scent that always permeated the former number one. He leaned towards the latter, as this specific scent of copper seemed strangely dissimilar to that of his own. He couldn't pinpoint the difference other than picking up on the fact that it was just plain different. It was strange, he wasn't sure if these smells had always been there and he just hadn't noticed or picked up on them, or if they were some new mutation of his quirk. Nothing about it felt new though, it didn't feel strange or out of place, the intensity of it wasn't different to what he remembered before. It was just now, he was noticing it more, picking up on the oddities that he would have brushed off a day ago. Hachin smelled sweet like caramel, one of the bonuses that came with sweating nitroglycerin. Could other people smell that? Could they predict the size of the explosion based on the intensity of the smell? Could he only do that because he had known the other boy so long and been on the receiving end of so many explosions, or was it a facet of his quirk he'd always had but hadn't noticed? Was it a mixture of both? Had he picked up on other people's scents? Was it weird if he did? Aizawa-sensei smelled like coffee. But that was surely expected, everyone noticed that, right? He smelled like coffee, and his cologne smells like the bourbon his mom once let him try a sip of, the smell much better than the taste. Then there was Iida, he smelled like orange juice and smoke, car exhaust smoke. It wasn't intense or unpleasant, but it was an obvious smell that Izuku now associated with his friend. Uraraka smelled faintly of sweat, she works out often and sweats when nervous, and more strongly of strawberries, courtesy of the flavored chapstick she swore by. Again, he found neither smells unpleasant, they were just specifically a part of her scent. Was that normal? Was he maybe more in tune with people's pheromones? Then again maybe he was just weird. Once he had his phone again and well his sight, he would need to do some more research into mutation quirks. He could already fill a full notebook just with the questions he had. If he wanted to document the answers, which he did, it was going to take lots of time and research and at least 3 more notebooks. And again, it would require his sight. Speaking of his sight, he wasn't sure how long it had been since the nurse had given him the eye drops. Maybe he should try opening his eyes again. Surely he would be all better now. He almost tried. He could feel his eyelids begin to twitch, but then, he stopped himself. The idea of seeing just that bright white again made him tremble. He didn't want to, wasn't ready to risk it yet. He pressed his eyelids shut just a tad more forcefully and let out a long, slow exhale, a warm feeling climbing his throat and expelling with a breath. He felt All Might's arm tighten minutely and the man inhaled a touch more aggressively than before. Before Izuku could ask about it, a soft scratch at his scalp had him humming in satisfaction, his thoughts seeping away from him, leaving him feeling like his mind was wading through molasses. Maybe he'd take a quick nap while he was free of pain and empty of tears. Yeah, a nap would be nice. He should have known better than to think this could all fly under the radar. He should have remembered that the media was a force to be reckoned with, that there was always someone watching. In the heat of it all, he had forgotten. And now he was stuck picking up the pieces. Someone had leaked a picture. He wasn't sure who or how they got it. But circling the internet was a picture of Izuku, laid out on a stretcher being ushered into the ambulance with a black-clothed figure with a white scarf on top of him. The picture was taken from a distance, but close enough to make out the face of Izuku. It must have been someone in one of the other apartments. They must have heard the commotion and snapped a photo without anyone noticing. It was all speculation right now. Not one article seemed to clue into the actual situation, thank God, but that didn't stop the headlines. UA student attacked in own home. Class 1A's tragic third attack, casualties unknown. Is the league still at large? We think so. More and more articles along the same vein kept popping up. It was a mess. And even worse than just the vultures of the media seeing the photo, his Hell class had found it as well. He and Mick had been stuck on damage control for the class, while Nedzu and some members of the police force tried to get the articles taken down or at least censored. From what he'd seen, they hadn't had much luck. While it was nice to see the kid so concerned for one of their classmates, Shouda honestly just wanted to hide in his sleeping bag and cry. God, he was so fucking tired. He scrolled up in the class chat to find the beginnings of today's chaos, which seemed to have started around 40 minutes ago. Problem children, not the grape. Volmart Pikachu. Whoa guys, have you seen this? Is Midabro okay? He doesn't look okay. https://u student etiquette anonymous !/ua -update /297369. Basically God. Oh dear. Is that Izawa sensei and All Might sensei as well? That cannot be good. Has anyone spoken to Midoriya-kun? Volmart Pikachu. Shit, yeah, that is Izawa Midabro. That bone snapped Yajid good. Gerba butt cuter. Wasn't Deku supposed to be here last night? That's on top actually him, right? Claspris. Midoriya-kun was visiting his mother for dinner last night. Although I assumed he had just come back late, as I never heard him return at Glitter Queen at Princey of Darkness did either. Have you seen Midoriya in the dorms? Lord Explosion. The nerd didn't come back last night. Claspris. Bakugo. Are you certain? Glitter Queen. The loud one is correct. Monami, our dear friend, was not here yesterday evening. Princey of Darkness. His brightness did not grace our floor last night. However, Dark Shadow saw Sensei leaving the dorms in a hurry late evening. Princey of Darkness. I fear that whatever darkness haunts that image is not something that has been fabricated. Brain Harrow. I saw him leave the dorms as well. Kiro, he ran all the way to the gates. Living Boulder. Then that means he must be with Midabro, right? If Sensei is with him, then he has to be alright. Izawa is too manly to let anything happen to our bro. White powder addict. I mean, it's Midoriya, Mr. Imganeber Kalmabanus Beetle Subathebijai. That's got to be fine. Hess one of the toughest dudes we know. Big Sensei. Hey dudes. Just letting you listeners know that Midoriya is Awoke. Izawa and All Might are with him at Mustafu General right now. God fucking damn it, his Ashi, why couldn't you leave that last part out? Gerba butt cuter. Dekukin's in the hospital. What happened? Volmart Pikachu. Wait, so the pic was real Aloyjid Huyenjin. Make Sensei, WHT happened ad. Basically God. Well, I disagree with Uraraka and Kaminari's approach. I too must ask what occurred. Claspris. Yes, that picture looks serious. It appeared that Izawa Sensei was giving Midoriya chest compressions. Was there a villain attack, Sensei? Was anyone else injured? Brain Harrow. Was it the League again, Sensei? They seem to have it out for Midoriya. Big Sensei. Again, listeners, right now Midoriya is alright. There was an incident at his apartment last night that's considered sensitive. information, but I can confirm that this was not the result of a villain attack. And the articles have zero clue what they are talking about. Capiche? Lord Explosion. The fuck you mean it wasn't a villain attack? Deku's in the fucking hospital. Living Boulder. Hey man, don't swear at Mick Sensei. Still though. I agree with Deku bro. How was it not a villain attack? Mick Sensei. Sorry kiddos, but I really am not in the place to share that information. Just know that Midoriya is safe and that this wasn't another directed villain attack. Try to relax and enjoy your Saturday, listeners. After a few minutes of silence in the chat, another message from Hisashi came through. Mick Sensei. Okay, Todoroki has just reminded me of something very important. As if right now, UA needs all of you kiddos to stay on campus so we can sort this press stuff out so all permissions to leave school grounds are temporarily revoked. Sorry. Cuter. Wait, Todoroki add Isahit, you wanted to leave campus. I thought you hated heading home. Isahit. I do. Cuter. So why did you want to go home? Isahit. I don't. Living Boulder. I'm extremely confused right now. Isahit. Why? Princey of Darkness. I believe I understand what's happening here. Isahit. There is not much to understand. Isahit. Unless you are willing to cover for me. Rainaharo. I think he wants to visit Midoriya. Cuter. That's a great idea. We should all go visit Deku-kun. Haba-sensei. Midoriya is not allowed any visitors. Cuter. Sensei, is Deku-kun okay? Haba-sensei. Yes. Don't blow up his phone too much, I'm pretty sure. It's dead and he needs time to recover. Isahit. What happened? He paused at that, well Hisashi could get away with saying he couldn't share the answers, he was pretty sure his students wouldn't accept the same response from him. He took a deep breath and began to mentally formulate a response before he received a message from an unsaved number. Unknown. What the fuck happened to Deku? Moments after, several more messages flooded in from the same number. Unknown. The hag saw an ambulance outside of his apartment. And Inko won't respond to her. Deku won't respond to me. He always fucking responds. Unknown. And don't bullshit me like Mick did, I'm not stupid. He looked fucking dead in that photo. Unknown. If the nerd is dead, I'm going to fucking kill him. Unknown. Answer me, old man. Ah. Bakugo. Shouda saved Bakugo's number swiftly, then pressed his eyes shut, a hand coming up to rub at his head almost feverishly. There was a building migraine starting behind his eyes that he was trying to force away. He took a long sip of water and paused where he was, eyes still shut, reveling in the blanket of darkness that eased his aching head. The hallway was decently empty, it had been for a while. If he was being smarter, he would have found an empty office like Tsukauchi had. Unfortunately for his rational brain, his worry for Izuku hadn't allowed him to go further than the hall just outside his room. It helped that they were in a secluded corner of the hospital, and with the time spent hovering outside of the room, he got a decent idea of what nurses worked this area and the ones that would be in and out of Izuku's room the most. He occasionally stopped them for updates, not wanting to intrude on the interactions between All Might and his successor more than he had to. So far, Izuku's lungs, esophagus, vocal cords, eardrums, cochlea, parts of unidentified brain tissue and the central area of his eyes had been the victims of his Quirk's rampaging evolution. He should have been in immense pain, and the nurses were certain that he was at least experiencing some, but judging from the confused looks they had shared, it was to a far lesser extent than expected. One nurse remarked that possibly the pain center of his brain was being affected as well, another believed he had simply gone into shock, an idea that was quickly disproven by other factors, while a third wondered if there had been some brain damage during his cardiac arrest they hadn't noticed previously. Shouda privately believed that his student was just numbed from the pain of breaking his limbs over and over again, that while he was in pain, he was used to working through it and fighting against it. There was no tangible proof either way, and Izuku's condition was too unpredictable for them to put him through the proper scans and tests they could use to figure it out. At least at this point, his transformation seemed to be settling down. He'd fallen asleep on Yagi, and while sleeping, the nurses had checked on his eyes. They seemed to be at least on a surface level, fully functional. They would have to take him to an optometrist to be certain, but his eyes and pupils now resembled those of a cat, a reflective tapetum even shining behind his pupils that he just knew Izuku would nerd out over once he woke up. The forest green of them had changed in hue as well, taking on a more neon coloring that resembled the color of the lighting that rumbled around Izuku when he used One for All. Yagi had beckoned him into the room as the nurses left, his posture wound tight but still smiling nonetheless. Shouda grimaced once he caught sight of Yagi's shirt, the front of it covered in gross-looking stains of pus and blood and God knows what else. Izuku, none the wiser to any changes in the room's occupancy, was snoring softly under the sheets. A snores rumbling out of him and growls that sounded almost like purring if he was being honest. Shouta was beyond relieved to see him so relaxed and at this moment lacking any sort of pain. It lifted a heavy weight off of his chest and he took what felt like his first full breath in hours. He reached and gave the teen's hand a squeeze, checking the pulse once more, a habit at this point. Yagi gave him a knowing sort of look that had Shouta's face falling into a scowl. The former hero was unfazed. Yagi glanced down at his shirt and his face twisted, skin growing pale. "You don't happen to have a spare shirt, do you, as Awoke-kun?" Shouta's scowl dropped and he let out a broken chuckle at the former hero's pleading tone. He tentatively sat down on Izuku's left, the chair he slept in still posed beside the bed. The chuckle quickly caught in his throat as he felt his phone buzz in his hand again. Undoubtedly more questions from his students. If he hadn't been so exhausted, he might have remembered that Bakugo and Izuku's mother were friends. That they lived in the same neighborhood too. He might have been able to prepare, been able to mitigate the damage. But in his exhaustion, that fact had evaded him. Of course she would have seen all the commotion and told her son when her friend wouldn't answer her. Of course that was his luck. Shit, he knew he couldn't get away with giving the kid a half-assed answer, but he really couldn't see what else he could do besides just giving in and telling him the truth. If Bakugo suspected anything was missing from his response, he wouldn't put it past the explosion Quirk teen to bully Mick into giving him a better answer. As much as he loved his Ashi, he didn't trust his husband to hold his ground against a worried Bakugo. Izuku and Bakugo always had a strange relationship that no one could ever quite understand. Sure, some things were clear. They had been childhood friends at one point and sometime later down the line that friendship had turned into bully and victim. Now it seemed to have gone back towards a tentative friendship, a rivalry really. The two shared a determination like no other and if Shouta was a betting man, he would place a substantial amount of money on those two taking spots in the top 10. They were some of his most promising students. They were also the students that caused him some of the most headache. It hit him suddenly that even if he didn't fully understand the teens' relationship, possibly the one man who did other the teens themselves was sitting in the chair across from him. All Might knew, Yagi understood them more than any of the other teachers had. He was faintly aware that the man in question was giving him an odd look. He ignored it and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. There was a tense moment of silence before he spoke. "Bakugo messaged me." Yagi's breath hitched, the man pressed his eyes shut and took what looked like a deep forceful breath. "What did you tell him?" he asked. "Nothing. He won't believe any half-assed response and I don't know how to give him a decent one." The older man sighed and ran a hand through Izuku's hair. The teen leaned into the touch with a satisfied hum, the hand Shouta still held giving a comforting squeeze even in his sleep. "He knows." A pause, then another sigh, "About one for all I mean." Izuku told him the first day of foundational heroics. He can't keep a secret from young Bakugo to save his life. The boy didn't believe him at first. "Naturally, it's insane even to me." Shouta interjected, a hazy sort of anger squeezing his vision. "I'm still angry I wasn't informed earlier I could have helped." Yagi's face took on a shameful expression, the hand in Izuku's hair stilling. "Why yes. I understand that now I should have told you. I am truly sorry." The sincerity in his tone had Shouta pausing, taking a moment as the anger cleared to look at the man, really look at him. Then he looked at Izuku, an aggressive wave of protectiveness flowing through him. "It's not important now." Shouta decided. Decisions were made and all that's done is done. He paused again, brows pinched in thought. "What should I tell him?" "The truth." Yagi answered almost immediately before his face reddened and he brought his hands up to gesture widely. "Or at least part of it. Until young Izuku can tell him the rest I don't know for certain," but his hands dropped and his tone turned serious again, "but I think Izuku and I are both tired of keeping secrets." Shouta let out a small hum of agreement, allowing his mind a moment to ponder. "I'll tell him the gist of it. I won't specify anything about the drug itself or about Izuku's mother." He decided. It was unlikely they would be able to keep the truth at bay for long, however Izuku deserved to have at least a little peace until then. Yagi hummed, one of his hands reaching up to rub at his neck, "That's for the best. This isn't the sort of news that should be broken over text. We can see about telling him more once young Izuku wakes up, I'm sure he'll want to go about this in his own way." They both stopped to look at the teen again, sharing a quiet moment. Shouta reached forwards and almost absent-mindedly thumbed away a bit of drool on Izuku's face. A fond upturn of the lips fighting his neutral expression. "Problem child." He murmured, unable to keep the quiet fondness from his tone. He and Yagi shared one final look before Shouta settled back into his seat, phone screen unlocked and eyes glued to the open chat. He took a breath and typed out a message. "Shouta is Awa. Izuku is alive. Last night he went into cardiac arrest as a result of a drug overdose, he is currently recovering from the side effects of the drug." There, keep it short and simple and hope to minimize confusion. No lies but no specifics either. Bakugo Katsuki. The nerd tried to kill himself. Oh. Oh no. Fuck. Fuck. Izawa-kun. Is everything alright? Yagi asked. Shouda kept his eyes glued to the screen, fingers frozen. Bakugo Katsuki. Why would he do that, what the fuck, why? Bakugo Katsuki. I'm coming there now, I don't give a shit what UA wants, I don't care, I'm coming now. Even through the text, Shouda could feel Bakugo's panic, he could feel it because he was sure it was identical to the panic he experienced when he first saw Izuku dead on his couch. Without thinking much more past the need to reassure his student, he reached up and pressed the call button. The kid answered immediately. Katsuki? He breathed, using the teen's given name without thinking. His only response was heavy huffing from the other line. Yagi's eyes were wide. Shouda ignored him and stood up, booking it back towards the hallway. He just didn't want to wake Izuku. Don't fucking call me that. Mick said, Mustafu General, yeah. Yeah, that's the closest to his mom's I'm fucking coming, tell the nerd I'm coming, okay. Katsuki, Izuku is okay. He interrupted, hoping the continued use of his given name would show the kid his sincerity and seriousness. His reassurance did not work, the heavy breathing over the phone only became louder, thick sobs audible through the speaker. Sounds he didn't know the kid was capable of making. No fuck he's not. He fucking overdosed, he tried to shout, I couldn't let him finish that sentence. Not only was it wrong, but the surety of Bakugo's voice filled Shouda with dread. He didn't jump to that conclusion based on only the information Shouda gave him, Katsuki jumped to that conclusion based on experience. This was not a suicide attempt. He poured every ounce of sincerity he held into that one sentence, praying that the teen heard it in his voice. Izuku did not know he was being drugged. A sharp intake of breath echoed through the speaker. Shouda's heart rate spiked. Please kid, just stay put, I'll get Mick to drive you over here and you can see for yourself and I can explain more, but I swear I will expel you if you try to leave UA without an escort. Boo. He paused. Bakugo's voice was calm now, the words so quiet it was more breathed than spoken. At his Ashi Mick, I mean, he'll escort you. Who drugged him? Another pause and a well-deserved sigh pushed its way past his lips. I can't tell you that, kid. He murmured. Not now, not yet. He rubbed at his eyes, suppressing a groan. I'll kill whoever did it. Another pause. Fucking hell, kid, I want to as well. That's why I need you to get Mick. He spoke softly, ignoring his own bloodlust, there's a lot to explain that I cannot share over the phone. This pause was longer than the others. The usual calmness that he felt in quiet moments completely evaded him as he waited for the teen's response. His head now pounding in distress. Damn it, where did he put his eye drops again? Fine. I'm going. He breathed out a sigh of relief. Keep me on the line, that way Mick won't give you a hard time. There was an affirmative grunt, then the slight sound of movement while Bakugo went to find his Ashi. He took the time to take several deep calming breaths. Yagi poked his head out of the doorway, his face mottled with concern. His Ashi's bringing Bakugo. He didn't elaborate further, Yagi either understood he'd likely been eavesdropping on the entire conversation or simply deemed further questions of lesser importance. He nodded and Shouda let out what was, at this point, probably his 50th sigh in the past 20 minutes. He'd messed up bad. He hadn't even thought about the possibility of Bakugo coming to that conclusion, which, in hindsight, was stupid when that was his first worry as well. But God, the sureness in Bakugo's tone, it was like he was certain that Izuku had done it, like he had been almost expecting it. Shit. He was going to have to talk to him about it. He just wanted to go to bed. That's it for today, guys, hope you all enjoyed this video. If you do, consider leaving a like, share and subscribe. And don't forget to check out the author of this story. All details in description. Thanks for watching, take care.